So I want to talk about Azure Resource Groups. So as you're spinning up CDNs, web apps, APIs, containers, all these resources that you can spin up in Azure, you're going to want to have some way of managing all of these resources. I mean, I don't really have a lot of production stuff, and I still probably have dozens or hundreds of resources in my Azure account. And so one of the mechanisms, or in fact the most important mechanism that you can use to manage resources, is called resource groups. So resource groups give you the ability to do tightly coupled containers to multiple resources of similar or different types. So we can have a container that contains our entire application, or we could have a number of containers, one container that contains our storage, another one that's got our APIs, another one that's got our web apps. We can compose these different resource groups depending on how we want to slice and dice the resources. It's important to realize that every resource must exist in at least or in one and only one resource group. So once you've created a resource in a resource group, it's in that resource group. You can move it. There are some operations that you can do to move resources, but at any one particular time, each resource exists in only one resource group. Also important to note that resource groups can actually span regions. So you can have a resource group that has resources spread out across the different data centers from Azure.
And that's pretty important when it comes right down to it, because if you can't spread across all of Azure in a single resource group, you couldn't put your entire application in a resource group, because resource applications in Azure tend to be spread across data centers for redundancy, for performance, for all sorts of different reasons. So if you couldn't scale them across, that'd be a big pity.
Right. So here, if you look at the slide, we can see a couple of ways of thinking about resource groups. So you could have a single resource group which has storage account, front-end VMs, back-end VMs, virtual networks, or you could have 4 different resource groups that bucket all of those different types of resources. The important thing is that the resource groups give you security boundaries, so you can divide them up for security, keeping separate security on separate portions of your application if you needed to do that, as well as billing. So when you get your Azure bill, you can slice and dice your Azure bill according to your resource groups, which is important when you have a large enterprise that's got different departments and you've got different accounting codes and so on. You want to be able to figure out which resources belong to which department, and one mechanism of doing that is by using the resource groups.
I like the way you mentioned security in there, because I think that's an important component. And with role-based access security, you can get some relatively granular control over what you're trying to secure inside your resource group. So one of the things you showed earlier in the slide, where you had one resource group versus multiple, and you mentioned the security might be different. Each resource group has its own set of definitions of roles, its own security, its own membership in those roles. So that's important to keep those distinct if you want to have different security boundaries. You create these roles inside of your resource group, and that's how you can help manage more effectively access to appropriate things. So for instance, you might have a dev, a test, and a production environment being 3 different resource groups, with the production one having radically different security boundaries than something like the dev environment, where we might let all the devs have administrative control.
Exactly right.
There's one other important thing about this, and that is when you have a resource group, you can create an ARM template. That's an Azure Resource Manager template, and it's basically a JSON file that contains the definition of your resource group and all of the resource. So you can totally simplify orchestration. You can say, here are all of the things that I want in here, put it in a template, and then bang, go out and stamp out that entire resource group. What's really interesting is that, and you do this all the time, right? Because you build out these insanely wonderful pipelines, these continuous DevOps, continuous delivery DevOps pipelines to Azure. And I'll come and I'll watch, and all this stuff is being built and everything, and then boom, there's an ARM template that goes out to Azure, and where nothing existed before, all of a sudden a website exists, a SQL database exists, CDN exists. All these things exist in one big hoorah out to the cloud. Now, go ahead.
I was going to say what's really important about these templates is that you can parameterize these templates,
Yes.
right? So again, coming back to your example of a dev and a test and a production environment, you may just want to run a single instance of your web app in development, but when you get to production, you may want to run 10 or 20 or 50 instances of your website.
Yes.
Now, you don't want to have a different template for each of these environments. You just want to have that to be a parameter that you can tweak. So you can take the same template, which has got all the resources that you require, and say, for this environment, I want to use this name, and I want this many instances of this plan.
Yep.
Right? And then use the same template in another environment like production, and then you're going to put the production-specific parameters in so that you have the G5s instead of just the standard small machines that you give to your developers.
So here's where we come all the way back full circle and we start talking about what we talked at the very beginning of the course, infrastructure as code. This is your infrastructure. You define the whole thing as code, declaratively in this JSON format, and you just hand it to Azure and say, make it so, and it gives you the entire environment. It's a beautiful thing. And it also does things that I think are interesting. If I want to make a change to my Azure environment, well, sure enough, I could go log on to my Azure environment and look at my UI and up the size of my VM from my A1 to my G5, my Godzilla machine. But that's not the best way to do it. The way you should do it in a DevOps world where you've got this continuous delivery and you're using infrastructure as code is you're going to want to open up that JSON file, change the A1 to a G5, and reapply the template onto Azure. And it'll look at it and say, you need a new storage account. Oh, no, wait, you already have it. It's idempotent. So it won't create the storage account. It'll say you already have it. It'll go through the whole thing and say, oh, you already have this machine. Ooh, but it's an A1. And it moves it to a G5 for you. And it does it without you having to, one, go through the UI and make these changes, and where you've lost all history of those changes. Instead, those changes are all documented in version control brilliantly. I cannot stress enough the importance of using an ARM template for these types of development.
Right.
One thing I will note, sometimes if you haven't used an ARM template much, it can be a little confusing as to what you can plug in where in the JSON format. Have no fear. Walk out, create a new resource group, add everything you want to it inside of Azure, and there's usually a little button there that says, hey, download the ARM template that'll create this resource group for me. You can pull that down and then make some changes and configure it and parameterize it potentially. So, resource groups, very important. ARM templates, which are used to generate resource groups, extraordinarily important as we start talking and living in this DevOps infrastructure as code world and really making that mind shift from on-premises to the cloud.